Hello, everyone. I'm Jerry Shikuma, ACC's Home and Community-Based Programs Administrator. Welcome to our speaker series, where we highlight interesting, thought-provoking speakers from our community. If you joined us yesterday, you know that we had end-of-life educator Julian Tarante here for the first time. And today, I have the privilege of introducing another first time to ACC Online, our speaker, Maryellen Burns. Maryellen is a well-known food historian and author of many books, including Lost Restaurants of Sacramento and Their Recipes, Whip Up a Cookbook, and A Taste of History. You know, Maryellen is an educator and a writer who has written on many topics related to regional food, culture, and history. And I think that food is such an interesting topic, not just because I love to eat, but because I think that food really helps us to connect to one another. You can learn a lot about somebody through food. You can learn about their background, their culture, their family. And at least in my family, food is also a great way to communicate with other people. It lets you share your feelings and your intentions, and it's also a great way to have a shared common experience. And so that's why I'm so excited that today we have Maryellen here to help us learn how to whip up a family cookbook. And so let's get started. I'm so excited to have her. Maryellen Burns, welcome to ACC.
Thank you so much. I am joined today by Helen Diepenbrock. Helen is someone I just met recently, and through our first meeting, we discovered that she had created her own cookbook based on her mother. And I thought it's wonderful to go through all of the steps, but it would be even better if somebody who's gone through the process will show it to you as well.
Very well. Thank you very much, Maryellen.
Not yet, Helen. I'm sorry. Next slide, please. So the talk today is how to collect, organize, and put family recipes and stories together into a family cookbook. We've brought a lot of samples for you. They can take many forms, which we'll talk about later. I wanted to give a quote from one of my favorite food writers by the name of Lori Colwin. She has a quote that says, "No one who cooks, cooks alone. Even at her most solitary, a cook in the kitchen is surrounded by generations of cooks past, the advice and menus of cooks present, and the wisdom of cookbook writers." And I think that can't be truer of people who have family cookbooks. And I'm just going to do a couple more. So you all have these in your family, I'm sure. I didn't, believe it or not. But most families have these recipes handed down through generations. They are full of family history and lore, and they contain a lot more than a catalog of what the family dishes are. They tell stories of struggle and celebration, scarcity and plenty, family and community, and they also provide a snapshot of time and place, often captivating glimpses into the past. So as I said, all of us have it. These are meant to share, and I brought a couple of books where people didn't share. This first one is from Abigail Adams Johnson. She is the daughter or granddaughter of Abigail Adams and John Adams. She started her cookbook in 1872 as a manuscript. She continued this until she was 72. She started when she was 16. But somehow the family decided to let this book go, and I was able to get it. What we're trying to encourage you to do is take your family recipes like Helen, and we're going to go over to Helen now, and make sure that you preserve those for future generations. And again, it can take many forms. It can take the form of a paperback book or a hand-done book or a scrapbook, hardcover book. You're trying to get them out of these little recipe cards and into something else that you can pass on and replicate. I'm going to go to Helen.
All right, thank you. Now, Maryellen, as you said, I'm here today to tell you a little bit about this book, which I created for my mother's recipes and her stories. I called it, the title page here is At Home with Kiki. That's what we called my mother. her recipes and remembrances from 90 years in the kitchen. It's a picture of my mother. And I want to read you just a little bit of the introduction so that you can understand the theme of this book, which is more than a recipe book. I say the inspiration for this book comes from memories of wonderful meals, family gatherings, and Mom presiding over the daily activities at 10B Fair Oaks, which was our family home in St. Louis, Missouri, where I grew up. Her story reflects hours of meal planning, shopping, cooking, entertaining, and all the other tasks that women of her era took on when they said, "I do." And that was 1942 when my parents got married. It begins in the 1920s with Mom's childhood and proceeds decade by decade, connecting her life to food, recipes, and household tasks. We encounter changes in homemaking, food trends, technology, and Mom's role in the kitchen. So the introduction went on, and my project evolved basically into a chronicle of our family life through activities and events that were related to food. Now, this is quite different than what I thought I would do when I first came up with the ideas of putting together just a binder of her recipes to pass on to my children. Actually, that seemed like a kind of ridiculous idea when I thought about it, because everyone in our family knew that my mother hated to cook, and she complained about it for all of her 70 years of marriage. She actually was a good cook, but she didn't think so. In truth, the project, it just sort of evolved without any particular goal. During my frequent trips to see my mom in St. Louis, Missouri, after my dad died, she had to give up her home, move into a nursing home, and for 2 years, she was not a happy camper. I might add here that she died when she was 97. Anyway, she hated everything about nursing homes. We moved her 5 times in 2 years. She missed my dad. And at the same time, I would go back and try to clear out her house. So I was really surprised when I came upon drawers full of old recipes. I always thought that she kept all the recipes she had in this little box. Wrong. Instead of pitching the recipes, I thought, well, I guess I will take them out to her and see what she was really thinking. Maybe I could put together a little binder for my girls. Well, she liked the idea, which was a surprise. And her first thought was, it's typical of my mother, we need to organize them. And there were hundreds of recipes. So I would leave and she would clip them together and maybe make a little note on that subject of what those bunch of recipes were about. Anyway, it gave her purpose. From here, we would chat about which one she liked and remembered, and that would lead to all kinds of memories. I learned so much about her life through the stories, prompted by these forgotten dishes. Sometimes there would be a recipe with a note on it. Other times there would be one that was signed by a really good friend, or maybe a friend she'd forgotten, and she'd start talking about that person. It gave her a lot of pleasure. Sometimes there were recipes that were clipped like these to old things from the newspaper or magazines, and nostalgic ads, and even bits of community history that were perhaps on the back of some of her recipes. She enjoyed that. I found several menu plans for parties she had, and then she would regale on how she pulled off this party and what kind of centerpiece she used, etc., etc. If she was down, I could get her laughing by asking her questions. How in the world did she cook on a wood stove when she and my dad was in the service and they were sent to North Dakota? Or how she cooked without a microwave or before frozen foods. I was really fascinated with her stories and how they reflected the history of food preparation and even events taking place in our country. I recorded her stories along with the recipes that she wanted to save, never thinking ever that it would lead to this book. At the same time, I'd been going through all these old photographs, so I would bring her pictures if they had anything to do with food as kind of a springboard for more of her memories. There'd be, oh, this was a great one, picture of World War II cooking in a small, I don't know if you can see that, but just great old family photos, always to do with food. Notice here, there was she was a fabulous table setter. That to her was much more important than the food. Anyway, so she would have these memories from the pictures. Also, I really wanted to do this whole life thing about her and her food, but she didn't really participate in the kitchen when she was a little girl. But the pictures also brought back memories of her mother, and even then it extended back to her grandmother, who were all cooks during the pre-dawn, just about the earliest stages of electricity. So here now I've got from she was born in 1916 to the 2000s, and that was, quite a long stretch of cooking. My mom died 9 years ago, and I was left with all these recipes and stories. That's when I decided to expand my cookbook into a life story. It became a lot bigger project than I ever dreamed. There was so much to organize. Well, that's when I decided to break it down decade by decade, recording Mom's life from childhood to old age through life in the kitchen, which we all said was the heart of the home. I used her stories about how she shopped, how she cooked, how homemaking changed, and big events in our life that always involved food. In putting the book together, I also depended on pictures and photographs, old magazine ads, to help break the monotony of what I had was a lot of typed pages. And finally, I expanded on Mom's story by researching the list of new foods each decade. And at the end of each chapter, I would put new foods that were introduced in that decade. And it was absolutely amazing how new foods have exploded. Saving the recipes for the end, I picked the ones that she prized along with our family's favorite. The recipe section takes up about just 1/3 of the book. And it included a comment, because most of the time she had a comment for these recipes, about that recipe. And my favorite part of that section is where I scanned the original recipes that were, sometimes she typed them, sometimes she hand wrote them, sometimes they were from wherever. And so I wanted to include that to give some authenticity to it. I think I'd give you a better idea if I show you a couple of pages from the book. Let's see. Here is, let's start with the 1920s. Mom arrived in the world in 1916, the same year as Coca-Cola, Campbell Soup, cornflakes, Hershey bars, and Heinz ketchup. Her memories of home in Cronlet, Missouri began in the dawn of modern cooking. Ice boxes and wood boxes were disappearing fast. So we had pictures per chapter. And here I had a couple of pages of the 1920s, but this one, I hope you can see, was hysterical. And she did not really like this picture, but I used it anyway. This was Thanksgiving. And she said, oh, that makes my family look so shabby. But basically, that's the way, people lived back then. In the kitchen, family gathering, and this turkey that when I show my daughters, they absolutely go crazy because it doesn't look like our butter balls or whatever today. I tried to bring in as many historical events as I could, such as, per decade, such as Prohibition. I never thought to ask my mother what Prohibition was like in her household. I just, read about it. Anyway, I found out that my grandmother would allow my grandfather to serve a little bit of his homemade alcohol to friends if they drew the blinds, closed the drapes, and turned the lights down low. I guess so the authorities wouldn't find them. Go on through the 1930s. The 1940s was my favorite decade because, not theirs, because of World War II, but I learned so much about how women of the era, let's see, I get a pictures. Women of the era cooked some of their favorite things with the rations. One of my favorite stories was her effort to make jelly. She had saved her rationing cards for sugar until she had enough jelly, and she had just become a new bride, and my dad loved jelly, so she was going to make this jelly. And she'd used all of her rationings for, I don't know, 6 months. And then she made the jelly, and it was so hard because she never made it before, they couldn't even scoop it out. She had a lot of disasters in the kitchen, probably why she didn't like it. But anyway, we all grew up surviving without grape jelly. All right, as I skip through, I am just delighted to actually be able to share with you 1950s chocolate chip cookies, her experiences in having to grind the nuts by hand and light the pilot light of the oven, all the way through to the 2000s, where she actually fell cooking my dad's favorite custard, and she was never able to go back home. So it was just a joy to be able to preserve these memories, and I'm happy that my children and grandchildren now have a copy of her life story.
Thank you. So thank you, Helen. I really appreciate that. Helen is going to be back to answer some questions from you. We want to make this as interactive as we can. So if you have any questions, just go ahead, please, and put them in. And we'll talk about what process she used for her book. So one of the reasons that I love these, Helen talked about hers, is that they make great presentations for friends and family members. They can be given for all different occasions. And when the children grow up and move away from home, at least they have a flavor or a taste of what you've done. Regardless of the reason, they're part of a family's heritage. They won't last forever. So that's why we want to reiterate, we want you to preserve these for future generations. And now I want to get started on exactly what you can do to do everything. These are going to be, I think that there was a slide beforehand, I'm not sure. This PDF is available, so there will be my email at the end. If anybody wants to send it to us or to ACC, we will send this out to you so that you don't have to take notes or anything else. The most important thing is what form it's going to take. You could keep them on a series of 4x5 cards. You could put them in a binder with hole punch. You can create a scrapbook. You can do an illustrated pamphlet book. You can do a handmade book, even just a Kindle copy or a PDF that is never printed, but you can just send in the mail, and it can take almost every form. What you need to do is to start with a plan and start with a date for completion. What I love about Helen's story, she didn't have any of this. Am I right, Helen? She just threw herself into it. But it's kind of nice to know if you've got a deadline especially, what are the steps that you're going to need to take to complete it on time? Do you have a budget? Are you going to be producing a lot of these? Or is it just a few family members that you're going to be giving it to? And are you just going to give it to family? Or is it something that you think is so valuable that you could sell it to others? I know that I would love to have a copy of Helen's book. The other thing is, do you want to tackle multiple generations or focus on what the family eats now, or one family member? In Helen's case, she focused on her mother. And then again, do you want to determine a theme? Do you want to, especially if you're involving other people, do you want it to be holiday dishes, or the food that you grew up eating, or even the food that you eat now? And then what do you want to include? Helen has a lot of original photographs. We're going to talk later about hand-drawn illustrations, stories, and photographs. And then I think always selecting a tantalizing title. Rather than just this is, Helen's mother's cookbook, she came up with a great title. And then who will put it together? So one of the things, and I want to mention Lawrence Fox is in the audience. He might ask some questions. He helps me put together everything because I find I'm a super creative person, but when it comes to using layouts and others, I'm not that good at it, and it's better to hire a professional designer or ask a friend. But is this going to be a solo project like Helen's? She just decided to take this on herself. Or is it going to be a team project that you end up involving other family members in? Do you need to hire a designer, or can you just use Word or Publisher or Blurb, which is, I believe, what Helen used, Lulu, or other templates that you can just get on the internet? The most important thing, if you are going to involve others, is to email or call or write each family with a member with your thoughts, and be very clear with instructions to invite them to add some of their own creativity to make it even better. So one of the things that I like doing, I'm a planner. I always like to know what I'm going to do. So I like to create a timeline. What I find is that if I start at the end date, I know that I want to have this out as a gift at the holidays. And if I'm going to be able to do that, I need to have it to a printer if I'm going to duplicate it long before that. So what are all the steps I have to take to get to that point? One of the other things is you need to gather all of your ingredients. Start with your family. Let your curiosity wander. Again, decide which family or friends to include and interview them. That's what Helen did, or have a conversation about them. And if you can record them on tape or video, that's something else that you can preserve for future generations. The other thing that I like doing is to read copies of family journals or diaries or cookbooks, favorite recipes that might have notes on them. Almost all of these cookbooks usually have a recipe that said this was an utter failure or this one worked really well. The other thing is you'll notice that I have some props. You want to explore your basement or the attic or someplace else for something that might remind you of a story. And I don't know if you can see this one. These are matches from Made Right sandwiches. And my brother loved Made Right more than anything. We actually would include a recipe of Made Right. That means most recipes don't come from a family member. They are not original. They are something we might have picked up as a copycat. But when we go to do that Made Right recipe, we're going to make sure that we might even have a photograph of this or a story about eating out at Made Right. And I don't know if you remember, but it's where I believe it was at 57th and J Street. The Kagetsu is there now. That's where the restaurant was. So the other thing is, I like to have a series of interview questions beforehand and a mechanism for recording them. I'm going to say that, and then I'm going to take that back. I actually like to have some questions that I'm going to ask somebody for an interview, but I think the more conversational you get, once you get of someone telling a story, they might talk for 45 minutes, and you don't have to worry about that. But you might not be able to see that person in person, so you could send some interview questions if you wanted to. Ask for photographs from family and include things like where the food was actually served, how the food was prepared, gathering all of the ingredients. If your family came from farming stock, did they actually grow their own fruits and vegetables? So gather as much of that as you can. The most important thing, I think, is to really incorporate family history. It isn't about the recipes at all. So one of the things that you can ask people in those interview questions are, what are their earliest food memories? What sort of things did your parents or grandparents cook? What were their best dishes that make your mouth water even now? Was there any special family dining tradition or holiday meal? When did they start to cook? And I want to share something of mine. I mentioned earlier that my mother, who was a horrible, horrible cook, my brothers and I learned how to cook to defend ourselves, literally by the time we were 8 or 10. My father's legacy to us was 14 cases of Chungking chop suey that he had purchased at one point. I thought my mother didn't leave any recipes. She didn't cook very much, and I didn't bring the original. But my brother just recently gave me a cookbook that he gave her, in which there are 10 recipes, and I've included them in a book along with the story about my mother. And what I love about the 10 recipes that she gave him, not one of them is the way she ever cooked a recipe. Because for most of us, how we learn to cook is by watching, being in the kitchen, and she must have thought that he was a boy, what did it matter? Right? She just gave him some simple recipes to follow. But when you see these recipes, again, I don't know that we're going to want to cook very many of them. I don't know how many recipes for cream of mushroom soup you have, but I'd rather avoid those if at all possible, but would include them. You need to collect those recipes. First, if you're going to people, you need to know what the name of the recipe is. You need to ask them, and you should send this form to everyone, asking for permission to do it. What's the name of the recipe? Who's the contributor or the originator? Is there a history of the recipe? Cooking directions? What's the prep and cooking time? And number of people the recipe serves, and any special cooking tips or advice. This is from a friend of mine, Gloria's mom's apple pie. She said, my mom was a horrible cook, so she would purchase a pie in Apple Hill and pretend to bake it. She'd add some shredded cheddar cheese on top when you heat it up for 20 minutes in the oven at 350 degrees. She serves either 1 or 8, depending on who was the first to sit down to eat it. So these can be whimsical. They don't have to be replicable, unlike a cookbook where we are looking at it so that we can replicate that dish exactly. The most important thing is be creative. And this is, we used to teach a class for kids called Kids Can Draw and Cook, in which we would create a meal and then the kids would create, or the adults would create, an illustrated recipe. You don't have to just type it up and write it that way. So if you want to add photographs, if you want to add some illustrated art, that's a great addition. And the most important thing is to remember that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So the other thing I think is important is to encourage younger children to contribute or ask them to send drawings. So if you have a favorite recipe from a family member, ask them to illustrate it, or a photograph of the finished product, or family reunions or other events where the family was served. Make colored copies or scans of family heirlooms. I know some people that use the originals so that you can keep the originals, but you still have the others to include in the book. The most important thing, nowadays all of us take photos when we go out to eat or when we cook, so you can always add photos of the final dish. I might mention that this is colored photographs. When you go to do the book, you can decide whether this is going to be a color book or whether it's going to be black and white. A lot of the pictures that you do will show up just as well in color, or you might decide to have a black and white book or just do a color copy in a sketchbook. The most important thing is give everyone a deadline and clear directions on how to send recipes and their stories. And you need to organize them. Helen talked about this a lot. How are they going to be divided? Are you going to put them under appetizers, meat, poultry, or by generation, or chronologically? If you have one family member or multiple family members that all have a version of the same recipe, are you going to include all of them? Or are you just going to include what you think is the one that's most definitive? So you need to select those recipes, and then you have to decide, are you going to test these or not? I would say for a family cookbook, you don't need to. People will test them for you. And then you need to put it into a form. Using Word is the easiest way to do it. You need to edit it, you need to polish it, and you need to edit it again, because those pesky errors can be so annoying for later. The other thing is that if you're going to do a commercial book, and I don't know about Helen's, we'll ask her in a few minutes, you need to think about all the things that you're going to include in the book. And in a normal book, you have acknowledgments, you have of the front and back covers of a book, you have an introduction page, you have a table of contents, and I'll show you those slides later. So just think about what are all the contents you're going to have. I would suggest when you start getting together a binder and sorting through things back. The other thing, are you going to have section dividers? Always include a few blank pages for people to be able to add their recipes to. And do you want an index? I like cookbooks that have pocket pages. That means you can have a cookbook that comes out. I like handmade ones. And then you can fold something so that people can add in their recipes later. And the important thing is, are there family stories or poems or photographs or memories? The other thing is, when you just go to lay out the book, there are so many options on the internet. So just search the internet for cookbook templates that appeal to you. You need to select an easy font or type that looks good to read. Palatino, Century, and Baskerville are some that we use almost all the time. You need to write an introduction. Helen read you part of her introduction. You need to incorporate photos and stories. Include a photo and short bio of the family at the end, especially the people who put this together. I have a real complaint about community cookbooks. I have over 300. I used to have over 3,000 of them. And I can't date them. I have no idea, except for the recipes in them, whether this was done in the 50s or the 60s or whatever. So make sure that you end up dating that book. The other thing is if you do have a family member who's deceased, if you can have a few short quotes about them and their recipe, that's a really nice touch, something that you can remember. Make a dummy. That's why I said get that binder. You create something so you can see how it's going to look first. And don't print it until you've proofed the book numerous times. Don't print until you're satisfied. So, most important thing before we're going to be getting to Q&A soon. The book will never be perfect or finished, so you might want to make it a work in progress. You might want to revise it later, or you might want to put it into a binder or something where people can add additional pages. That's really easy with spiral-bound books, and that's the other thing you're going to have to determine when you do the format, how you're going to do that. And you're almost done. So one of the things is, and we talked about it, how are you going to replicate it if you are going to replicate it? If it's just a single copy for you, that's one thing. And we suggest quite a few places. We have the good fortune of, in Sacramento, having the I Street Press through the Sacramento Public Library. Some of you saw James Scott the other day talk about the treasures in the Sacramento room. About 10 or 12 years ago, Larry and I were instrumental in helping to get what was called an espresso book machine that printed a book on demand. We still have that capability at the library, at least for a little while, so you can do that. Or you can decide to use Amazon or Blurb. Morris Cookbooks is a commercial place. There's lots of places. Look on the internet. Or you can use Lulu or other kinds of places that you can use as well. Most important thing is it's all done. How are you going to deliver it? How are you going to get it into the hands of the people who contributed? Especially if they live far away. It's real possible that they're in another state. So you have to think about it. Are you going to charge people for it? Are you going to send it to them? Are you going to do first-class mail or third-class mail? And the most important thing is that for some of us that sell our books, and I like to put mine together and have other people read them, you might actually need to have a marketing plan. And you'd be surprised, there are family cookbooks that have sold over 100,000 copies that are for sale right now on Amazon. Most important thing, celebrate. I'm sure that Helen did when she was done. Have a launch party, invite people over. Ask them to bring those recipes with them so that you can actually taste what it is. Have a gathering of friends and family that tell those stories so that you can hear them. And always tape or record when you can. My phone is always on. I probably have 700 interviews of people that don't know that they've been interviewed or stories that I've collected. So have a party. I should have done this in the beginning, but I really want to thank Lawrence Fox. He is a partner in crime on all of these books, helped with the I Street Press and with other things. This project actually came out of a 6-week class that we taught at Bell Coolidge. Vicki Rondo, Jerry Ward, and Rick Sass from the Sacramento Public Library ended up funding that because this isn't an easy process. We did it over 12 weeks so that people could actually put the book together. I also want to thank Danny Lee and Jerry, who's here, Ted Fong, Sean Hidalgo, and the crew at ACC TV. And now we have some resources. And this is something, again, that we can send out to you. There are all kinds of places, if you just search on the internet, that you can get. We can send these again. I'm hoping that I remember to put an email, Morning Coffee 2014, I think, at gmail.com. Hopefully it's going to come up in just a second. Do we have one more slide, or was that? And again, thank you. And here's the email, morningcoffee 2014 at gmail.com. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask us, I'm going to have Helen come back in. We had hoped this was going to be a hybrid where people could actually share a story. So come on in, Helen. But if you have any questions that people have done, or I might have some questions of Helen, now's the time to ask. Thank you, Kathy Hart. Kathy Hart, I am trying to get her to be a speaker here. She does wonderful classes, by the way, on watercolor. She'd be great. So thank you, Kathy. And are there any others in the chat? All right. So I'm going to ask Helen a question. Helen, what did you use for the format for your book?
I used Blurb.
Okay. Can you explain what Blurb is?
Blurb is an online publisher. I did this several years ago. I think there's others out there today that might even be easier. Basically, I know Photoshop. I think it was Elements. I took a class, Elements 7 or 8. That's probably now way old, but it's on my computer. So what I found, I did not like the template ideas because, as you said, I just had too much stuff to use the templates that were on the Blurb site. So then I decided to design each page as a photograph on Photoshop and import it then as a whole page to the Blurb site. Now, if you haven't done it before, you probably don't understand what that means, but instead of using their templates, I produced the whole page and then imported that. It was easy to do because I could use Microsoft Word and then import that as the text. Right. I use my own background. I just found this at the Joann's to create the design, because I wanted to design, and then I put it all together.
Great. And can I ask why you chose hardcover versus a paperback or a spiral bound?
Well, I really wanted this to be like a really nice product to inspire future generations of women in our family to cook and be good, gracious homemakers.
And can I be so rude as to ask what it costs to produce? And then I'll talk about production costs for other things.
I can't exactly remember, but what I did do was prohibitive because I needed about 6 copies. And so I started watching the sale, and I have been doing that with different things that I've done online, different photo albums or what have you, because I found it right around Christmas time, they go down to 50%. So I just saved and waited till I could find a sale. And
that is a good clue. If I get them all the time from Blurb. Are yours color as well?
Yes, as both. Actually, every page is color.
Okay, good. And there are some really good sites. Ingram Spark is one, Lulu and others. Check out the prices. One of the things that I like about I Street Press, if they can keep going, is that they will only charge you for the color part of the pages, not for the black and white. So you could do a soft cover version of her book for probably around $10. This book is about 90 pages. At I Street Press, this ran about 6. Larry does books for me all the time, am I right? 200 pages, sometimes for $3, $4 on Amazon. Printing on demand now is so wonderful. And that's going to be the other thing. If you're going to go the route that Helen did and produce a hardcover book, if you can print on demand a paperback first so that you're proofing from that copy and not that expensive copy, there's nothing worse when you just have to start marking up a hardcover book. If you can do it that way, that would be a wonderful way of being able to produce it. Do we have any other questions coming in yet?
Actually, I have to laugh because I had so much and I didn't know. I would get confused. Oh, I'm so unprofessional, unlike Maryellen. I was so confused on which page was what. So I put this together as a little,
dummy.
I mean, it's ridiculous, a little mock-up, but I found it the most helpful thing in all that I did. What I was going to put on, what was the back, what was the front. It's a job to organize.
Good. Now, I just want to show you one more thing. Up. Good. I picked this by random. Don't feel like this is a daunting task. Helen decided to do an entire book. I like putting together books. Start with a single little card and get one recipe done and illustrate just that and send that off to people. That's why I like hand illustrating or using something else to get inspired. And then we have, what if we don't know the measurements of the ingredients? I'm going to answer. Helen might have another one. So for most of us, we learn from our parents or our grandparents, how to cook, or from a family friend. They did a pinch of this and a taste of that. So if you don't know what they are, that's when I'm going to suggest tasting it. Take the recipe that somebody has and see if you can't figure out yourself what a good ingredient would be for that to taste good, if you care about the taste. If it's replicability, some of my parents' food tasted horrible, but I still want their recipes. So I'm not that concerned. However, again, if you look on the internet, there are lots of sites that will tell you that a teacup full is about a quarter of a cup. And a pinch of this is usually, so much. So there are sites that will help you to be able to do that. The other thing, and I'll ask Helen this to answer that question, tablespoons or TSP or teaspoon, are you going to use, abbreviations, or are you going to spell it out? So I'm going to ask you the same thing. What would you do if you didn't know the amount of ingredients?
Oh, I had to experiment because some of my things, like my mom's dressing, she gave me the recipe, but I knew, no, it was nothing like. She used tons more butter. So then I just had to try it a couple of times, and usually I could get pretty close to the taste.
Right, good. So are there any other questions? Larry, do you have any that you want to throw out to us?
Where would be a good place to come up with ideas other than home?
For a family in terms of themes? Again, I'm just going to say searching the internet. You'd be surprised if you just go to, especially Etsy, etsy.com, how many family cookbooks are on Etsy. You'll get an idea of themes. If you put in just the word, I would do the same thing we did. How do you put together a cookbook? They'll take you past different kinds of themes that you want to do. I think the most important, and I'll let Helen answer this too, is really, what are you trying to convey? Is it this really about capturing, to me, it's capturing the flavor and the character of the person that I'm trying to celebrate, or the people that I'm trying to celebrate, the time and place that I have. And so I might not worry too much about chronology or something else. I might just decide, you know what, this is a family cookbook, and I'm just going to organize it simply, as we said, with appetizers and others. Helen, you want to answer?
I just totally agree with you. I think the history grabbed me. And once I found out this reflects the history of the times and things that were going on, actually socially too, then I got really interested. And there was one page I did want to show if we have time.
Okay, great.
This was really cute. It was the 1980s, and women were getting a totally different idea of homemaking. Where is that? Changing times on the home front. And I had all sorts of stuff in newspaper. I got a lot of that off of the internet, ads and what have you, vacuum cleaners, and the way that it's this page right here. I'm not too good at this. Backwards. Oops. Not this one. Never mind. I can't do it. But the woman's changing role. The little woman was all dressed up in her high heels, pushing the vacuum cleaner, or in her professional clothes then, and women's lib begins at home. It was just really a kind of a history of the time.
Good. And I want to add just one more thing before we close. I suddenly realized as I was preparing this that I don't think that there is a single recipe that I've eaten from either of my grandparents on either side of my family. The only thing that I know for certain is that my grandmother, who was supposedly a fantastic cook down in Los Angeles, used to make Charlotte Russe. And so what I did was to look at cookbooks. And a Charlotte Russe, for those that don't know it, lady fingers that go around with a kind of a blancmange or a custard. She used to put raspberry petals or raspberry on the top of it. It was a super fancy dessert that she was known for. So what I did was thinking, well, when did she create that dish? I made a really fancy version for it, and then I realized that's probably not what she made. So she was in LA, and I went to the LA Times, which had an archive, and I looked for their recipes for Charlotte Russe. And that's when I realized that's most likely the kind of recipe. And then I also looked at, there weren't anybody that knew her, no family members, but I also started looking at variations of how you make it. And I come from a Jewish family, very different preparation of how Jews would make that dish versus others. So might not be my grandmother's recipe, but I can still tell that story in the book and have people recreate it. So is there anything you'd like to do to
I had something
to
really
close?
similar. My mother loved her grandmother's gingerbread. And I searched and searched for how you would make gingerbread in 1920. And I finally found a recipe. And then I had to go back and I asked a friend who's very knowledgeable about flour, which would be the most similar flour. And the gingerbread was horrible. But they were used to it because, you know, it was all different kind of flour, and they probably left it out in the cupboard a lot longer than we would today.
Good. And one thing that I'll ask Helen one last question, and then I'll answer. How long did it take you to put together your book?
The entire process was about 3 years.
Okay. So Larry and I did this book in 6 weeks, from start to finish. We don't recommend that. This book took 4 years. So don't be afraid of letting it sit for a while you decide what's going to go in it. It's not something that you have to do overnight. And again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. I'd like to thank Helen, who joined me at the very, very last minute. I have to tell you that even though I knew her by reputation, we hadn't met. When we got together, I found out that her husband's family actually owned my house. And so what I'm going to do next is to find out if she's got any family recipes from them.
Yeah.
And I have been able to gather family recipes from my house. I'm going to do a cookbook based on my house because of the people who lived in it, including a series of Japanese cooks that worked in my house. So I want to thank Helen. I want to thank Larry for all the work he's done before, and Ted. Again, this is one of the books. They are still available. They are a fundraiser. We can make this a fundraiser for ACC. The books are just $15. We'll pay for the shipping if you want a copy. And again, if you contact me, I'll be able to send you a PDF of all of this. So thank you guys very, very much. We love being here and can't wait to come again.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to quickly come in and plug our next time, the next time that Maryellen is going to be back here with us. So she is coming back on March 21st at 2 p.m. to talk about the city of immigrants and their impact on food culture in Sacramento.
Thank you. I'll come back on. And I really want to encourage you. I don't know if we're going to be able to do hybrid by then. But if we can, it would be wonderful, because the best part of these stories is the stories of real people, and that's what I'm going to be doing. So it's not just going to be a history lesson, but stories from people whose family came here. So thank you.
Oh, we can't wait. Today was so much fun. I can't wait. I have a whole binder at home of recipes that my mom typed up for all of the children. So I might start on a project just like you guys were talking about. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you, Maryellen.
Thank you.
And thank you, Helen and Larry, too. We really appreciated having you.